he had that answer, and he said, you are going to die a violent death because you had the audacity to ask about where God came from. I've grown to be old now, but 30 years or so down the line, I still don't have that answer. But one thing that I have come to understand in growing up is that, honest and earnest as my father was in trying to understand who God was, he could not understand and he could not explain the origins of God, because that is outside the understanding of man. But you see, the answer that he gave me 30 years ago was inspired not by malice, not by anything, but it was informed by his own limitations as a human being. You see, we are faced as Christians with this responsibility of seeking to know God. But then we do not quite have the capacity, because if God was such that man could completely figure him out, I wouldn't worship such a God. So my father was giving me a God concept which is informed by the limitations of man. His understanding of what God could be and what God was informed by, because man has no capacity. He has no capacity to put everything into perspective and explain it. So this is our point of departure. Man has this very, very limited capacity to understand God. But this is the man that should represent God. This is the man that should introduce God to others. I want us to read for this evening's message, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 33. I will read the version that I have here. It says, they worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. So 2 Kings chapter 17 introduces us to a situation in Israel when people were brought into the land of Israel from other places. These people were taken from whatever other places they were living, and they had gods that they were worshiping there, and they were brought into the land of Israel, and they were supposed to settle there. So they were actually settled and they were there. One thing that I did not expect is that these people would worship God. But 2 Kings 17:33 says they did. So when they got into the land of Israel, they were convinced that God was powerful and he was worth of their worship. So they worshipped him. But the same verse said, despite worshiping God, they served their own God according to the customs of the nations from which they had come. This is where the problem is, and this is where I want you to follow me very closely. These people believed in God, and they actually worshipped the God of Israel. But there was one problem. The God of Israel wanted to know whom they were living with. The God of Israel wanted to know what they ate. The God of Israel had concern about how many days in a week they were working. The God of Israel had a lot of questions about who they were. So what do? They still worship the God of Israel, but they served their own gods. So if they, when they wanted to go to fetishes and other things, they would look for Diana, the god of fertility. So despite worshiping the God of Israel, they still sought to have all the other gods. Why were they having all the other gods? They wanted affirmation in the things that they were doing, because they had problems with a God who wanted to know how they were making their money. So in as far as their businesses were concerned, when it came to how they made money, they looked for a God who did not ask questions about those things. So between the man and the God, it was the man who gave God his own image. Because these men were looking for a God who could be what they were. Because they were crooked businessmen. And because they were crooked businessmen, they wanted a God who could give them affirmation in the crookedness of their businesses. So they created a god after their own image. So they came up with a god who was what they were, not what they wanted to be. So between God and the man, it was the God who got the image from the man. So each one amongst them who had 15 wives, when they wanted to worship God, they looked for a God who was comfortable with the number of wives that they had. When they wanted to keep everything that they earned to themselves, they looked for a God who did not ask about tithes and offerings. So between them and their God, it was them who inspired God. So their image is what they gave to God. So at this point, if you walked into that place, you would realize that they made the rules and the gods affirmed. So they cut the gods into the side that fitted their own personalities, their perspectives, and their lifestyle. Let me bring this closer home. There are so many things that we never thought we would need to discuss. Questions that we thought were self-evident truth at some point in existence. But if you walk into the church today, those are questions that people spend a long time discussing and debating about. What has changed? Man is looking for a God that he can give an image. He's trying to create a God that fits into the personality that he has. Is the reason why it has become so comfortable in the church today. A lot of questions that used to be asked yesterday are not asked anymore, because we have come up with a God after our own image. It is our lifestyle which is informing who God should be to us. If I have a business that is not so transparent, and I have money from that business, and I don't want to be asked question, I have to invent a God in the house of God that accommodates that kind of thing. A God after their own image. So everything that they were doing after this point, they felt so comfortable in all the things that they knew the God of Israel was not going to approve. Because as humans, we basically function very well with affirmation. When you dress well, you want somebody who tells you that you're looking very good, even when you're well dressed. Why is that? We do well with affirmation. So many they were feeling lonely in their waywardness. And they wanted gods that could go with them to the depths of their depravity. They wanted gods who reflect who they were, as opposed to gods who had the personality that they should assume. This is the problem that we have today. We are at a point in the history of existence where man has become a god unto himself. And because he still wants affirmation from the gods, he comes up with a God concept in which everything that he is what the God should become. So it's him who informs the God instead of God's personality to inform what man should become. Now, I remember somebody telling a story about 3 blind people who went to see an elephant. When they went there, because they were all blind, the first one was by the hind legs of the elephant, and he was feeling that. The second person was feeling the tummy of the elephant. The other one was feeling the snout of the elephant. At the end of the day, when they were describing what the elephant is, the one who was by the hind leg said the elephant is a pillar. And the one who was by the stomach said it's a wall. And the other one said it's a long tube. Every one of them was giving a description, but the reflection that they were giving was basically reflecting their own limitations, not what the elephant is. So in our lives, sometimes the God concept that we live with reflects not who God is, but our own limitations. David, one day, he was traveling with the Ark of the Covenant. And then Uzzah died because he touched the Ark of the Covenant. And David was very angry, and he said, how can I take this ark with me? Because this is an angry God. How can we ever take this ark and live with it? He had that question. Why? Because he had an experience with God. But that was a very limited experience. It was too limited to be a complete picture of who God really is. We have a problem of a people who reflect God from their limited exposure to him. They have this very limited exposure to God, and they don't have the capacity, like my father, like the story of my father that I told you. They don't have the capacity to completely and fully understand God. And what do? They take that narrow perspective of who God is, and they run around and say, this is who God is. God is angry. He killed Uzzah. But this is the same God whom David goes on to write about, and he says he is abounding in mercy. So you can, because of the limitations of your own understanding of God, come up with a God concept that does not fully reflect who God is. A lot of us here have problems with people who do not belong to our families. We have problems with people who do not belong to our tribes. We have problems with people who do not belong to our country. We have problems with people who do not eat like we do. We have problems with people whose skin coloration is not like ours. And that is why we have a problem with understanding that God is not Adventist. Because God cannot be anything else which is not our tribe, which is not our church. So we have a limited understanding of who God is because of our own limitations, and that is the persona of God that we reflect. So the God that we reflect is not the full picture, and because it is not the full picture, it is a misleading reflection of who God is. I remember at one point we went for outreach with my friends, and whilst we were out there, I remember there was this lady. We were studying with the husband, and after a long time studying with the husband, he decided to be baptized. But when we were studying with the husband, each time we came to study with the husband, the lady would do everything in her power to stop that discussion. And my heart hated that woman for that. I was so disappointed with her that I had ruled her out ever being saved. I was so certain that she was the devil incarnate. But when I went back to that church 2 years down the line, the husband had died, and that woman was the only one amongst the many people that we had baptized at that church who was true in the church. What was the problem with me? When I was looking at the concept of God, I overlooked my own limitations. I do not understand what is going to happen tomorrow. I have no capacity to know what is in the hearts of men. I have no capacity to know what tomorrow is going to bring. I have no capacity to know what people think in their sleep. But then I thought I had it all figured out. A God after my own image. So the God that I reflected to this woman was a God who was informed by my own limitations, despite me being very serious and being very honest and being very earnest in my endeavors to get this woman saved. So sometimes in our honestness and in our earnestness, we tend to forget that we have limitations in understanding and in comprehending everything that God is. That is why we think God can only be worshipped according to the way we worship in our village. Because we have problems with people who do not eat like us. They eat weird things. People who do not dress like us, they dress weirdly. So when we have God, we have a problem accepting and processing a God who can accept people who do not cook the way we cook. If you were to forget everything that we are going to discuss tonight, I need you to leave this place with this idea that we have no capacity. We have no capacity to fully figure out God. And because we do not have that capacity, we need to remember in everything that we do. If we are going to redefine how God is working, if we are going to redefine what is a man and what is a woman, we need to remember that we have no capacity to fully define who God is. If we are going to come up with questions about things that God has explicitly told us about, then we need to remember that we have no capacity. In fact, when we try and be God, when we try and explain everything that God is, we are basically self-deifying. We are trying to be gods in our own selves. A God in our own image. Paul writes in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, he says, now we see but a dim reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. This is an important idea that Paul brings. Paul acknowledges his own limitations in understanding and in knowing who God is. So he says, we see dimly. This reminds me of some workshop that I attended sometime last year. I went to this workshop where they were police officers that were teaching people about drunken driving. So they had these goggles that they had. So they gave me a pair of goggles and they said to me, you can wear these goggles. So I wore those goggles and they say, this is how you see if you have taken 10 drinks, 10 pints of alcohol. When I was wearing those goggles, I could hardly see. And at the back of my mind, I was busy trying to process, how can somebody wear this and try and drive? Because I can't even see. Houses look like trees look like cars. How does somebody wear this and drive? So that's what Paul is saying here. There is a man who sees dimly as if in a mirror. And that man asks questions and he says, I'm so disappointed with God. I'm so disappointed with God. Let me tell you something. If you are disappointed with God, you are not the first one. David was disappointed with God after Uzzah died. And he said, I'm not taking this ark with me. But was God different when God left the ark and when he took it? No. What changed between God leaving the ark of God, David leaving the ark of God and picking it up? It was his own understanding. So the attitude that David had when he left the ark, because he said, I can't take it with me, had changed when he came to collect it. I'm praying that you have a different attitude if you do not understand anything about God. I'm praying that you understand it is an act of faith, taking God for who he is, even though you cannot explain it.